The invitation had arrived on cream cardstock, embossed with gold script, the kind of paper that announced its own importance before a single word was read. Charlotte Whitfield had traced the letters with her thumb the night it came, smiling at her sister's handwriting beneath the printed text. "Can't wait to see you and Graham there." That had been 6 weeks ago. Now, Charlotte stood at the base of a curved marble staircase inside the Aldridge Manor estate, smoothing the front of her navy dress, watching her husband adjust his tie for the third time in as many minutes. Graham Whitfield was not a man who wore ties often. His hands, rough and permanently sun-browned from 20 years of construction work, looked out of place fumbling with silk. He'd scrubbed them raw that morning, Charlotte knew, trying to get the last traces of drywall dust out from under his nails. It hadn't quite worked. There was still a faint gray line along one knuckle, a signature of the life he'd built with those hands. "You look handsome," Charlotte said, reaching up to fix the knot herself. "I look like a guy trying to look handsome," Graham said, but he smiled. And the smile was the same one that had made her fall for him a decade ago, back when he was framing houses for $11 an hour, and she was waiting tables to get through nursing school. They had built everything slowly, deliberately. Nothing had ever been handed to them. Her family had never quite let her forget that. Inside the grand hall, chandeliers the size of small cars, threw prisms of light across white orchids and gold-rimmed china. Charlotte's sister, Ivy, was marrying into the Ashcombe family. Old money, older opinions, and the entire event had the hush of something curated for a magazine spread rather than lived in. Charlotte's mother had reminded her twice on the phone this week to have Graham wear the navy suit, not the gray one, and for heaven's sake, tell him not to talk about work. Charlotte hadn't told Graham that part. They approached the reception table, where a woman in a headset, crisp black blazer, clipboard pressed to her chest like armor, was checking names against a printed seating chart. Her name tag read, "Vanessa, Event Coordination." "Whitfield," Charlotte said. "Charlotte and Graham. Table 12, I believe. We're with the bride's side." Vanessa's eyes moved from Charlotte's face down to Graham's hands, lingering there half a second too long before flicking to his shoes, sturdy, polished, but unmistakably work boots dressed up for the occasion, rather than dress shoes bought for one. Something shifted in her expression, subtle but unmistakable. The practiced condescension of someone who had learned to sort people quickly and rarely, apologized for the sorting. "I'm not seeing a Graham on the family table," Vanessa said, running a manicured nail down the list. "There's been a change. Table 12 is reserved for immediate family and honored guests only. We've had to make some last-minute adjustments to accommodate the head count." She offered a smile that did not reach her eyes. "We do have overflow seating set up near the service corridor. It's just through there." Charlotte felt her stomach drop. "He's my husband. He's not overflow." Of course, Vanessa said smoothly, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. "It's simply a matter of, well, we like to keep certain tables cohesive. Presentation matters to the Ashcombe family, and I'm sure you understand." Her gaze flicked once more to Graham's hands. Graham said nothing. He had spent enough years being underestimated by men in tailored suits on job sites. Men who assumed a hard hat meant a lesser mind that a wedding planner's condescension barely registered as new. But Charlotte felt it like a slap, hot and sudden, spreading up the back of her neck. "He built things with his hands for a living," Charlotte said quietly. "That's not a character flaw." "I never said it was," Vanessa replied, already looking past them to the next arriving couple, dismissing the conversation as concluded. "The service corridor tables have a lovely view of the garden." Charlotte's mother appeared a moment later, drawn by the tension, the way she always seemed to sense a scene before it fully happened. She took in the situation with a single practiced glance, and, instead of defending her son-in-law, simply murmured, "It's one dinner, Charlotte. Don't make a thing of it." That was the moment something in Charlotte went very still and very cold. She looked at Graham. He had already picked up their place, cards from the overflow table, his own initiative, sparing her the indignity of watching someone else move them, and was walking toward the corridor without a word of protest, the same quiet dignity he carried onto every job site, where a client assumed the man swinging the hammer couldn't possibly also be the man who owned the company, because that was the thing. Nobody at this wedding knew. Nobody except Charlotte and the small circle of people who'd worked alongside Graham for the better part of a decade. Graham Whitfield didn't just build things with his hands. He owned the company that built them, and 4 years ago, that company had taken on the restoration of a crumbling, water-damaged, half-condemned, Gilded Age mansion just outside the city, a building so far gone that 3 other contractors had walked away from the bid, calling it a money pit, not worth the liability. Graham had seen something else in it. He'd spent 18 months personally overseeing the restoration of its original crown moldings, rebuilding its grand staircase beam by beam, matching hand-carved balustrades to century-old photographs because the originals had rotted through. He hadn't just built the Aldridge Manor estate back to life, he owned it. Every square foot of the marble floor Vanessa was standing on, every chandelier casting light over the orchids, the very reception table with its clipboard and its seating chart, all of it belonged, quietly and without fanfare, to the man currently being walked to a folding table near the kitchen doors. He'd never told Charlotte's family. It had never come up, mostly because Graham didn't lead with ownership the way some men led with a business card. He led with a level, a tape measure, and a willingness to do the parts of the job nobody else wanted. The property management company handled all bookings under a separate LLC name. To most clients, Graham was simply the contractor who did the renovation, a footnote, easily overlooked, exactly the way he preferred it. Charlotte sat down across from him at the overflow table, furious in a way she rarely allowed herself to be in public. "This is insane. You restored this building." "I know," Graham said, unfolding his napkin with the same calm he'd have used at a family diner. "Doesn't mean I need to make a scene about it at your sister's wedding. I don't care whose wedding it is." "I do," he said, and reached across the table for her hand. "Let them have their night. It's not worth it." For the first hour, Charlotte tried to let it go, the way Graham seemed able to. But the slights kept accumulating in small, cutting increments, the way the waitstaff skipped their table twice during the champagne toast, the way Vanessa's assistant referred to them, within earshot, as the ones from the overflow section, the way Charlotte's aunt leaned over during the salad course and asked, not unkindly, but not kindly either, "So, Graham's still doing the construction thing? That must be steady work, at least." Steady work. As though he punched a clock somewhere and collected a paycheck someone else signed. The turning point came just after the first course was cleared, when a low groan rippled through the ceiling above the main hall. A deep structural creak followed by the unmistakable hiss of water. A section of the newly restored ceiling near the eastern wall, above the dance floor, had developed a leak. Not from Graham's work. That section had been untouched in the restoration. Original plaster the family had insisted on preserving rather than replacing, against his professional recommendation 18 months earlier. But a stain was spreading across white paint in real time, directly above 200 guests in their finest clothes. And a thin trickle of water had begun to darken the edge of the dance floor. Panic moved through the event staff like electricity. Vanessa, headset crackling with the venue manager's voice on the other end, was visibly unraveling, clipboard forgotten, hands pressed to her temples as she tried to figure out who to call, what code violation this might trigger, whether the fire marshal needed notifying, whether 200 guests needed to be evacuated from a room with a compromised ceiling during a wedding reception that had cost more than most people's annual salary. "We need the property's structural engineer," the venue manager was saying, loud enough now that nearby tables could hear. "Someone find out who's on emergency contact for ownership. This needs sign-off before we can even move people near that section." It was Charlotte's mother, of all people, scrolling frantically through her phone for the venue's booking confirmation, who found the emergency contact line buried in the fine print of the rental agreement. She read the name aloud without recognizing it, simply relaying information to the increasingly frantic coordinator. It says, "Whitfield Restoration Group. Contact G. Whitfield." The room did not go silent all at once. It went silent in a slow unraveling, table by table, as heads turned toward the corridor by the kitchen doors, toward the folding table where a man in a navy suit, with faint, gray dust still lodged beneath one fingernail, was calmly finishing his second glass of water. Vanessa's face went through several stages of realization in the span of about 4 seconds. She looked down at her clipboard. She looked at the emergency contact sheet in the venue manager's trembling hands. She looked, finally, at Graham. "You're G. Whitfield," she said, as though testing whether saying it aloud might make it untrue. "That's right," Graham said, setting down his glass. He stood, unhurried, the way he always moved, on a site inspection. No rush, no theater, just the quiet competence of a man who had walked into 100 crises before this one. "Show me where it's coming from." He crossed the dance floor in a dozen even strides, past guests, who parted without quite meaning to, past his mother-in-law's stunned expression, past Vanessa, who was now trailing him with the desperate energy of someone trying to reverse an hour she couldn't take back. He looked up at the stain, ran a hand along the crown molding beneath it, his own crown molding, hand matched to century-old photographs, and within 30 seconds had identified the problem: a failed seal on an old skylight 2 floors up, unrelated to any of his structural work. Exactly the kind of maintenance issue he'd flagged in writing to the family 18 months ago and been overruled on. "It's contained to the plaster, not the load-bearing beams," he said, loud enough now for the nearest tables to hear, his voice carrying the same calm authority it carried on any job site. "Get a tarp over the skylight access and shut off water to that line. The dance floor's fine. Nobody needs to leave." The venue manager, practically vibrating with relief, turned to the room and announced, in a voice cracking with gratitude, that the situation was fully under control, thanks to the property's owner, who happened to be a guest at tonight's event. The property's owner. The words moved through the reception hall like a current. Charlotte watched her mother's face change in real time. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, a kind of stunned recalculation that seemed to rearrange every assumption she'd carried about her son-in-law for a decade. She watched Ivy, radiant in her wedding dress, cross the room with wide eyes to ask Charlotte, in a whisper, if it was true. She watched Vanessa, headset now dead silent, approach with an expression caught somewhere between mortification and damage control, already rehearsing an apology that would arrive far too late to undo the last 2 hours. Graham didn't gloat. That wasn't in him. He accepted the venue manager's thanks with a nod, checked once more that the leak was contained, and walked back across the dance floor to the overflow table. Not to the family table, not to some upgraded seat offered in a rush of embarrassed courtesy, but back to the folding chair beside his wife, where he sat down and picked his napkin back up like nothing had happened at all. "You could have let them move us," Charlotte said, half laughing, half still furious on his behalf. "I like it here," Graham said. "Good view of the garden." But something had shifted in the room, and it didn't shift back. For the rest of the night, guests who had barely acknowledged Graham's existence found reasons to stop by the overflow table to thank him, to ask questions about the restoration, to marvel at the hand-carved balustrades he'd matched from 90-year-old photographs. Charlotte's mother came by last, standing awkwardly beside the folding table for a long moment, before she finally said, quietly, "I owe you an apology." "Several, actually." "You don't owe me anything," Graham said, and meant it, because that had always been the quiet strength in him. He had never needed the recognition to know his own worth. He'd known it. Every single day, he swung a hammer on a house nobody thought could be saved. The same way he'd known it, sitting at a folding table near the kitchen doors, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit right, beside the one person who had never once needed a headset and a clipboard to know exactly who he was. Later that night, driving home with her shoes off and her feet propped on the dashboard, Charlotte reached over and laced her fingers through his. "Table 12, next family wedding," she said. "I'm putting it in writing." Graham laughed, low and easy, the calluses on his hand rough against hers. the same hands that had built the very walls the wedding had been held inside. "I'd have been happy at the overflow table forever," he said, "as long as you were sitting next to me." And that, Charlotte thought, was the part her family had never understood, that the man they'd almost seated by the kitchen doors had built the whole house they were standing in, and had never once needed anyone's permission to know it.